双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
A Vanished Arcadia, being some account of the Jesuits in Paraguay, 1607 to 1767, by R. B. Cunningham Graham. I dedicate this short account of A Vanished Arcadia to the author of Santa Teresa, her life and times, being certain that the life of all saints is to them and us in Arcadia, unknown to them and to us vanished with their lives, yet still remembered, fitfully, as are the Jesuits, in Paraguay, by a few faithful, when the Angelus wakes recollection in the Indians' hearts. But then, the Angelus, even of memory, is to the most part of mankind only a jangling of an antiquated bell. Preface. Historicus nascitur. Non-fit. I am painfully aware that neither my calling nor election in this matter are the least sure. Certain it is that in youth, when alone the historian or the horseman may be formed, I did little to fit myself for writing history. Wandering about the countries of which now I treat, I had almost as little object in my travels as a gaucho of the outside camps. I never took a note on any subject under heaven, nor kept a diary, by means of which my youth departed, and the countries I once knew so well transmogrified, I could, sitting beside the fire, read and enjoy the sadness of revisiting, in my mind's eye, scenes that I now remember indistinctly, as in a dream. I take it that he who keeps a journal of his doings, setting down day by day all that he does, with dates and names of places, their longitude and latitude duly recorded, makes for himself a meal of bittersweet, and that your truest Dulcamera is to read with glasses the faded notes jotted down hurriedly in rain, in sun, in wind, in camps, by flooded rivers, and in the long and listless hours of heat, in fact, to see again your life, as it were, acted for you in some camera obscura, with the chief actor changed. But diaries, unless they be mere records of bare facts, must of necessity, as in their nature they are autobiographical, be false guides, so that, perhaps, I in my carelessness was not quite so unwise as I have often thought myself. Although I made no notes of anything, caring most chiefly for the condition of my horse, yet when I think on them, Pampa and Cordillera, virgin forest, the passes of the rivers, approached by sandy paths, bordered by flowering and sweet-smelling trees, and most of all the deserted Jesuit missions, half buried by the vigorous vegetation, and peopled but by a few white-clad Indians, rise up so clearly that, without the smallest faculty for dealing with that which I have undertaken, I am forced to write flowers, scents, the herds of horses, the ostriches, and the whole charm of that new world which those who saw it even a quarter of a century ago saw little altered from the remotest times, have remained clear and sharp, and will remain so with me to the end. So to the readers, if I chance to have them, of this short attempt to give some faint idea of the great Christian commonwealth of the Jesuit missions between the Parana and Uruguay, I now address myself. He who attacks a subject quite fallen out of date, and still not old enough to give a man authority to speak upon it without the fear of contradiction, runs grave risk. Gentle, indulgent reader, if so be that you exist in these the days of universal knowledge and self-sufficient criticism, I do not ask for your indulgence for the many errors which no doubt have slipped into this work. These, if you care to take the trouble, you can verify, and hold me up to shame. What I do crave is that you will approach the subject with an open mind. Your Jesuit is, as we know, the most tremendous wildfowl that the world has known. La Guardia Nera of the Pope, the order which has wrought so much destruction, the inventors of Scientia Media, * cradle from which has issued forth Molina, Suarez, and all those villains who, in the days in which the doctrine was unfashionable, decried mere faith, and took their stand on works. Who in this land of preconceived opinion can spare it a good word? But, notwithstanding, even a Jansenist, if such be left, must yet admit the claim of Francis Xavier as a true, humble saint, and if the sour-faced sectary of Port Royal should refuse, all men of letters must perforce revere the writer of the hymn. The doctrine of the Scientia Media occurs in the celebrated Concordia Gratii et Liberi Arbitrii by Luis de Molina, 1588. The Concilium de Auxilius was held to determine whether or not Concordia was possible between free will and grace. As the Jesuits stuck by Molina and his doctrines in despite of councils and of popes, the common saying arose in Spain, pasteles en la pastelería y ciencia media en la compañía. But into the whole question of the Jesuits I cannot enter, as it entails command of far more foot and half-foot words than I can muster up. Still, in America, and most of all in Paraguay, I hope to show the order did much good, and worked amongst the Indians like apostles, receiving an apostle's true reward of calumny, of stripes, of blows, and journeying hungry, athirst, on foot, in perils oft, from the great cataract of the Parana to the recesses of the Taramention woods. Little enough, I personally care for the political aspect of their commonwealth, or how it acted on the Spanish settlements, of whether or not it turned out profitable to the court of Spain, or if the crimes and charges of ambition laid to the Jesuits' account were false or true. My only interest in the matter is how the Jesuits' rule acted upon the Indians themselves, and if it made them happy, more happy or less happy than those Indians who were directly ruled from Spain, or through the Spanish governors of the viceroyalties. 4 theories of advancement, and as to whether certain arbitrary ideas of the rights of man, evolved in general by those who in their persons and their lives are the negation of all rights, I give a fico, yes, your fig of Spain, caring as little as did ancient Pistol for Palabras, and holding that the best right that a man can have is to be happy after the way that pleases him the most, and that the Jesuits rendered the Indians happy is certain, though to those men who fudge a theory of mankind, thinking that everyone is forged upon their anvil, or run out of their own mold, after the fashion of a tallow dip, a theory which, indeed, the sameness of mankind renders at times not quite untenable. It seems absurd because the progress of the world has gone on other lines, lines which prolonged indefinitely would never meet those which the Jesuits drew. All that I know is I myself, in the deserted missions, 25 years ago, often have met old men who spoke regretfully of Jesuit times, who cherished all the customs left by the company, and though they spoke at second hand, repeating but the stories they had heard in youth, kept the illusion that the missions in the Jesuits' time had been a paradise. Into the matter of the Jesuits' motives I do not propose to enter, holding that the origin of motives is too deeply seated to be worth inquiry until one has more information about the human mind than even modern scientists seem able to impart. Yet it is certain the Jesuits in Paraguay had faith fit to remove all mountains, as the brief stories of their lives, so often ending with a rude field cross by the corner of some forest, and the inscription Hic Occisus Est survived to show. Some men, such as the complexity of human nature, have undergone trials and persecutions for base motives, and it is open for anyone to say the Jesuits, as they were Jesuits, could do nothing good. Still, I believe that Father Ruiz Montoya, whose story I have told, how falteringly, and with how little justice to his greatness, none knows better than myself, was a good man, that is, a man without ulterior motives, and actuated but by his love to the poor Indians with whom he passed his life. Today, when no one can see good in anything or anybody outside the somewhat beefy pale of the Anglo-Saxon race, I do not hope that such a mere dabbler in the great mystery of history as I am myself will for an instant change one preconceived opinion. For I am well aware that speeches based on facts are impotent in popular assemblies to change a single vote. It is an article of Anglo-Saxon faith that all the Spanish colonies were maladministered, and all the Spanish conquerors bloodthirsty butchers, whose sole delight was blood. This, too, from the members of a race who, But in the multitude of the greyhounds is the undoing of the hare. Therefore, I ask those who imagine that all Spaniards at the conquest of America were ruffians to consider the career of Alvar Núñez, who also struts through his brief chapter in the pages of my most imperfect book. Still, I admit men of the stamp of Alvar Núñez are most rare, and were still rarer in the 16th century, and to find many of the Ruiz Montoya brand, Diogenes would have needed a lantern fitted with electric light. In the great controversy which engaged the pens of many of the best writers of the world last century, after the Jesuits were expelled from Spain and her colonial possessions, then almost half the world, it will be found that amongst all the mud so freely flung about, the insults given and received, hardly anyone but a few ex-Jesuits had any harm to say of the doings of the order during its long rule in Paraguay. None of the Jesuits were ever tried. No crimes were charged against them. Even the reasons for their expulsion were never given to the world at large. Certain it is that but a few years after their final exit from the missions between the Uruguay and Parana, all was confusion. In 20 years most of the missions were deserted, and before 30 years had passed no vestige of their old prosperity remained. The semi-communism which the Jesuits had introduced was swept away, and the keen light of free and vivifying competition, which beats so fiercely upon the bagman's paradise of the economists, reigned in its stead. The revenues declined. All was corruption, and, as the governor, Don Juan José Verdes, writes to the viceroy, the secular priests sent by the government were brawlers, drunkards, and strikers, carrying arms beneath their cloaks, that robbery was rife, and that the Indians daily deserted and returned by hundreds to the woods. Dean Finesse.
Ensayo de la Historia Civil del Paraguay.
Etc.
Buenos Aires, 1816.
Edom. The letter is dated 1771, and the Jesuits were expelled in 1767. As the writer of the letter was on the spot in an official position, and nominated by the very viceroy who had been the expeller of the Jesuits, his testimony would seem to be as valuable as that of the ablest theorist on government, Catholic or Protestant, who ever wrote. All the reports of riches amassed in Paraguay by the Jesuits, after the expulsion of their order, proved to be untrue. Nothing of any consequence was found in any of the towns, although the Jesuits had had no warning of their expulsion, and had no time for preparation or for concealment of their gold. Although they stood to the Indians almost in the light of gods, and had control of an armed force larger by far than any which the temporal power could have disposed of, they did not resist, but silently departed from the rich territories which their care and industry had formed. Rightly or wrongly, but according to their lights, they strove to teach the Indian population all the best part of the European progress of the times in which they lived, shielding them sedulously from all contact with commercialism, and standing between them and the Spanish settlers, who would have treated them as slaves. These were their crimes. For their ambitions, who shall search the human heart, or say what their superiors in Europe may, or perhaps may not, have had in view? When all is said and done, and now their work is over, and all they worked for lost, as happens usually with the efforts of disinterested men. What crimes so terrible can men commit as to stand up for near upon 2 centuries against that slavery which disgraced every American possession of the Spanish crown? Nothing is bad enough for those who dare to speak the truth, and those who put their theories into practice are a disgrace to progressive and adequately taxed communities. Nearly 200 years they strove, and now their territories, once so populous and so well cultivated, remain, if not a desert, yet delivered up to that fierce growing, subtropical American plant life, which seems as if it fights with man for the possession of the land in which it grows. For a brief period those Guaranis gathered together in the missions, ruled over by their priests, treated like grown-up children, yet with a kindness which attached them to their rulers, enjoyed a half-Arcadian, half-monastic life, reaching to just so much of what the world calls civilization as they could profit by, and used with pleasure to themselves. A commonwealth where money was unknown to the majority of the citizens. A curious experiment by self-devoted men. A sort of dropping down a diving bell in the flood of progress to keep alive a population which would otherwise soon have been suffocated in its muddy waves. Was doomed to failure by the very nature of mankind. Foredoomed to failure. It has disappeared, leaving nothing of a like nature now upon the earth. The Indians, too, have vanished, gone to that limbo which no doubt is fitted for them. Gentle, indulgent reader, if you read this book, doubt not an instant that everything that happens happens for the best. Doubt not, for in so doing you would doubt of all you see, our life, our progress, and your own infallibility, which at all hazards must be kept inviolate. Therefore, in my imperfect sketch, I have not dwelt entirely on the strict concatenation, after the Bradshaw fashion, of the hard facts of the history of the Jesuits. I have not set down too many dates, for the setting down of dates in much profusion is, after all, an ad captandum appeal to the suffrages of those soft-headed creatures who are styled serious men. This, of course, applies to the possessions of all European states in America equally with Spain. Wandering along the bypaths of the forests which fringe the mission towns, and set them, so to speak, in the hard tropical enamel of green foliage, on which time has no lien, and but the arts of all-destroying man are able to deface, I may have chanced upon some petty detail which may serve to pass an hour away. A treatise of a forgotten subject by a laborer unskilled, and who, moreover, by his very task challenges competition with those who have written on the theme, with better knowledge, and perhaps less sympathy. A pother about some few discredited and unremembered priests. Details about half-savages, who
ne portaient pas des hautes de chausses.
The recollections of long silent rides through forest paths, ablaze with flowers, and across which the tropic birds darted like atoms cut adrift from the apocalypse. A hodgepodge, salmagundi, olja pudrita, or sea pie of sweet and bitter, with perhaps the bitter ruling most, as is the way when we unpack our reminiscences. Yes, gentle and indulgent reader, that's the humor of it. R. B. Cunningham Graham, Gartmore, March 30, 1900. Contents. Chapter 1 Early History. State of the Country. Indian Races. Characteristics of the different tribes. Dobrozoffer's book. Various expeditions. Sebastian Cabot. Don Pedro de Mendoza. Alvar Núñez. His expedition and its results. Other leaders and preachers. Founding of the first mission of the Society of Jesus. Chapter 2. Early days of the missions. New settlements founded. Relations of Jesuits with Indians and Spanish colonists. Destruction of missions by the Mamelucos. Father Maceta. Padre Antonio Ruiz de Montoya. His work and influence. Retreat of the Jesuits down the Parana. Chapter 3 Spain and Portugal in South America. Enmity between Brazilians and Argentines. Expulsion of Jesuits from Paraguay. Struggles with the natives. Father Mendoza killed. Death of Father Montoya. Chapter 4 Don Bernardino de Cardenas. Bishop of Paraguay. His labors as apostolic missionary. His ambitions and cunning. Pretensions to saintliness. His attempts to acquire supreme power. Quarrels between Cardenas and Don Gregorio. The temporal governor. Chapter 5 Renewal of the feud between the bishop and Don Gregorio. Wholesale excommunications in Asunción. Cardenas in 1644 formulates his celebrated charges against the Jesuits. The governor, after long negotiations and much display of force, ultimately succeeds in driving out the bishop. For 3 years Cardenas is in desperate straits. In 1648 Don Gregorio is suddenly dismissed. Cardenas elects himself governor, and for a short time becomes supreme in Asunción. The Jesuits are forced to leave the town and to flee to Corrientes. A new governor is appointed in Asunción. He defeats Cardenas on the field of battle, The latter is deprived of his power and dies soon after as Bishop of La Paz. Chapter 6 Description of the mission territory and towns founded by the Jesuits, their endeavors to attract the Indians, religious feasts and processions, agricultural and commercial organizations. Chapter 7 Causes of the Jesuits' unpopularity, description of the lives and habits of the priests, testimony in favor of the missions, their opposition to slavery, their system of administration. Chapter 8 Don José de Antequera appoints himself governor of Asunción, unsettled state of affairs in the town. He is commanded to relinquish his illegal power. He refuses and resorts to arms. After some success, he is defeated and condemned to be executed. He is shot on his way to the scaffold. Renewed hatred against the Jesuits, their labors among the Indians of the Chaco. Chapter 9 The Spanish and Portuguese attempt to force new laws on the Indians. The Indians revolt against them. The hopeless struggle goes on for 8 years. Ruin of the missions. Chapter 10 Position of the Jesuits in 1761. Decree for their expulsion sent from Spain. Bucareli sent to suppress the colleges and drive out the Jesuits. They submit without resistance. After 200 years they are expelled from Paraguay, the country under the new rule, the system of government practically unchanged. Chapter 11 Conclusion. A Vanished Arcadia being some account of the Jesuits in Paraguay 1607 to 1767. Chapter 1. Early history, state of the country, Indian races, characteristics of the different tribes, Dobrozoffer's book, various expeditions, Sebastian Cabot, Don Pedro de Mendoza, Alvar Núñez, his expedition and its results, other leaders and preachers, founding of the first mission of the Society of Jesus. With the exception of the French Revolution, perhaps no event caused so much general controversy at the end of the 18th century as the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain and Portugal and their colonial possessions, as no definite charges were ever brought, at least in Spain, against the members of the Company of Jesus, King Charles III. Having kept the reasons ocultas y reservadas and the proofs privilegiados. Curiosity is to some extent not satisfied as to the real reason of their expulsion from the Spanish possessions in America. It is almost impossible to understand nowadays the feelings which possess the average man in regard to the Jesuits from the middle of the last century till a relatively short time ago. All the really great work done by the Society of Jesus seemed to have been forgotten, and every vulgar fable which it was possible to invent to their prejudice found ready acceptance upon every side. Nothing was too absurd to be believed. From the calumnies of the Jansenists to the follies of Eugene Sue, the mass of accusation, invective, and innuendo kept on increasing in intensity. Indiscriminate abuse and unreasoning hatred, mixed with fear, seemed to have possessed all minds. Even Pascal confesses, in a postscript to the 9th provincial letter, that after having written my letter I read the works of Fathers Barry and Binet. If such a man as Pascal could be so grossly unfair as to write a criticism on works which he had not read, what can be expected from the non-judicial and uncritical public which takes all upon trust? From Japan to the interior of Bolivia there is scarcely a country in which the Jesuits have not labored assiduously, and in which they have not shed their blood freely, without hope of reward. Yet it would require much time and a lengthy catalogue to enumerate the list of satirical and calumnious works which have appeared against them in almost every language in Europe. Of these, perhaps the most celebrated is the well-known Monarchia de los Ellipsos, * by Padre Melchior, an ex-Jesuit, who describes the company in the worst possible terms. It is interesting chiefly on account of the portraits of well-known people of the time, 1615 to 1648. As Pope Clement VIII, Francisco Suarez, Claudio Acquaviva, and others, veiled under easily distinguishable pseudonyms. The object of the writer, as the title indicates, is to show that the Jesuits endeavored to turn all to their own profit. In this, if it was the case, they do not seem to have been greatly different from every other associated body of men. whether lay or clerical. The celebrated Spanish proverb,
Jesuita y se ahorca. Cuéntale hace.
meaning, even if a Jesuit is hung, he gets some good out of it, may just as well be applied to members of other learned professions as to the Jesuits.
Asterisco Madrid 1770.
The world has rarely persecuted any body of men conspicuous by its poverty, or, if it has done so, has rarely persecuted them for long. The Inquisition of Spain, violent against the wealthy Jews and comfortable Moriscos, took little notice of the gypsies.
But, then,
Pobre como cuerpo de gitano was and is a common saying in Spain. As in the case of the Templars, persecution only began against the Jesuits when it became worthwhile to persecute them. Ignatius Loyola, Francisco Xavier, and Diego Lainez, as long as they confined themselves to preaching and to teaching, were safe enough. Even the annals of theological strife, bloodthirsty and discreditable to humanity as they are, contain few examples of persecutors such as Calvin or Torquemada, to whom, ruthless as they were in their savage and narrow malignity and zeal for what they thought the truth, no suspicion of venal motives is attributed. Of the Jesuits' intrigues, adventures, rise and fall in Europe, much may be said in attack or in extenuation, but it is not the intention of the present work to deal with this aspect of the question. It was in Spanish America, and especially in Paraguay and Bolivia, where the policy of the company in regard to savage nations was most fully developed, as it was only the Jesuits who ever succeeded in reclaiming any large number of the nomad or semi-nomad tribes of those countries. Many excellent works in French, and the celebrated Cristianismo Feliz nel Paraguay, of the Abate Muratori in Italian, certainly exist, but neither Father Charlevoix, the French historian of the missions, nor Muratori was ever in Paraguay, and both their books contain the faults and mistakes of men, however excellent and well-intentioned, writing of countries of which they were personally ignorant. Both give a good account of the customs and regimen of the missions, but both seem to have believed two readily fabulous accounts of the flora and fauna of Paraguay. Asterisk. The fact of having listened too readily to a fable about an unknown animal in no way detracts from the general veracity of an author of the beginning of the 18th century. For in all other respects except natural history Charlevoix keeps within the bounds of probability, though of course as a Jesuit he holds a brief for the doings of the company in Paraguay. Muratori is more rarely led into extravagances, but is concerned in the main with the religious side of the Jesuits, as the title of his book indicates. Asterisk, though in this respect Charlevoix is not so credulous as Padre Ruiz de Montoya and the older writers. He yet repeats the story of the bird that cleans the alligator's teeth, the magic virtues of the tapir's nails, and many others. See Charlevoix, Volume 1. BKI. Page 27. Paris, 1756. The story of the bird that cleans the teeth of alligators is very nearly true. Flavianus Aegyptius has a symbiotic relationship with crocodiles in parts of Africa, and similar relationships exist throughout the natural world. A. L. 1998. Many other French writers, as Raynal, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, have treated of Paraguay under Jesuit rule, but their writings are founded on hearsay evidence. A German, Father Dobersoffer, stands alone. Asterisk. His delightful history of the Abipones, an equestrian people of Paraguay, is perhaps the most charming book dealing with the subject. A simple and easy style, a keen habit of observation, long acquaintance with the country, a zeal for the conversion of the infidel, not only to Christianity, but to a more comfortable mode of life,